Great, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and a very warm welcome to the BEARR Trust's autumn lecture. An especially warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Edward Lucas. Edward is already very well known to many of you, former senior editor at The Economist, currently writes for The Times, and he is an expert of many years standing in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, Edward has generously offered to give his lecture tonight in support of the BEARR Trust's Ukraine Emergency Winter Appeal. And I'd like to thank everybody who's donated to it. And if you haven't donated but would like to, we have put the link at the beginning of the chat. Since we launched our original Ukraine appeal, which we did immediately following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, we've raised more than £350,000. Everybody hear that? I think there may have been a problem with muting there. Yeah. So I was just saying we've sent almost £300,000 to nearly 60 small local organizations in Ukraine and Moldova, and they've used that to buy emergency supplies. We're hoping very much that we can raise enough money to continue supporting them throughout the winter. A couple of housekeeping things just to let you know about. First of all, I think you're already aware that we are recording Edward's lecture, and it will be available later on the BEARR YouTube channel. So if you know anybody who registered but was not able to join this evening, they will be able to see the lecture later on in a few days' time. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that Edward has kindly offered to take questions. I think there could be quite an interesting discussion, and I'd like to invite you to write your questions into the chat. And we will get through as many of those questions as we can when Edward has finished speaking. Now, as you know, Edward's expertise ranges very widely from politics and economics through to security issues. His subject tonight is the fraught question, a question that many of us are asking: what is Putin's endgame? Edward, over to you to answer that question.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for this. Is possibly the most interesting event happening online on this particular Monday in November, at least in our part of the world. And it's terrific also to see so many friends, former boss, former colleagues, I think at least one relative among the assembled participants. I long for the days when we can do this in person again and maybe have a glass of something restorative afterwards. I want to begin just by underlining the importance of contributing to the appeal. It's important both in humanitarian but also in geopolitical terms, as we'll be discussing later on. It's absolutely vital for all our security that Ukraine wins this war. And one front is the infrastructure front, and their humanitarian aid really does make a difference. So that comes with double underlining in bold italics from me. I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then look very much forward to your questions. And the first point I want to start off on is one that perhaps with this audience is less likely to be controversial than it is with some people I talk to. I do a lot of talks for hedge funds and people in the city and who do political risk, who tend to think that this is all a tremendous surprise. Why on earth did Putin go crazy and make this strange decision to attack the war, to attack his most important neighbor, crash the economy, and give us all such headaches? And I think particularly with this audience and people who've been dealing with Eastern Europe, or region we used to call Eastern Europe, for so long, this point won't be quite so dramatic, but I want to make it anyway and to underline some of the details. This is only a surprise if you weren't paying attention. I was living in the Baltic states straight after the Soviet collapse. And I remember thinking that most of the world thinks that three things have happened, but actually it's only two. One thing that had clearly happened was the collapse of the planned economy. We felt that very deeply, not least because we were so cold, but the planned economy had visibly ceased to work, indeed, even before the August 1991 events. And it was also clear that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had lost its monopoly of power, which had been the sort of hallmark of everything in the Soviet Union since 1917. And indeed, that had also happened to a large extent before August 1991. And then there was a third thing that the world thought had happened, but we didn't feel actually had happened, and that was the end of empire. It was true the empire had taken a tremendous knock with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the forced withdrawal of Soviet forces from places like East Germany, where they thought they were going to be forever. And indeed, the breakup of the Soviet Union was also a tremendous blow to the into the inner core of the Soviet empire. But it seemed to me, based in Tallinn as I was from 1992 onwards, that the idea of empire was still there, a bit like Voldemort in Harry Potter. It had sort of gone into deep retreat, but it wasn't actually dead. And perhaps the first sign of this was the Karaganov doctrine. I suspect some people unusually on this call may actually know who I mean by Sergei Karaganov, and may even remember the speech he gave in 1992, where he outlined this idea that Russian speakers are a political category, and that the Russian Federation had the right and duty to intervene in other countries on behalf of those Russian speakers, and those Russian speakers were a bastion of political influence. And I remember at the time in Estonia, we felt this pretty keenly, with a substantial population of people who Karaganov would regard as Russian speakers, and also many people, including me, who are Russian speakers, but perhaps didn't fall into his definition. In fact, most of the population of Estonia speaks Russian to some extent or another, but wouldn't fall into his definition. But it was, you already felt the cold breath of imperialist thinking, particularly from this sort of cultural hegemony point of view, but actually with a potential real hard power behind it. And the rest of the world didn't really seem to pay any attention. There was a great feeling of sympathy towards the authorities in the newly independent Russian Federation, the idea that those difficult nationalists, as they sometimes were called in the former republics, as they were sometimes called, or occupied territories as they called themselves, should go easy on their local Russians and not make things more difficult for people like Gaidar and Yeltsin. And I was already quite alarmed by this. It seemed to me as odd as the idea that Britain would intervene to protect English speakers in the Indian subcontinent, or in newly independent African countries, or in Ireland, and that the whole idea that Russian speakers were a political category was fundamentally flawed and quite sinister. The warning was given very explicitly by the Estonian president Lennart Meri in a speech in Hamburg in 1994, where this was at the Metias Supper, which is a big sort of Baltic Sea event hosted by the government of the federal state of Hamburg. And he gave a very prescient speech, which is still there on the Estonian presidency website, where he warned that Russia was on a trajectory of repression at home and aggression abroad. And that was pretty troubling, that Estonia and the other Baltic states were feeling it. And what particularly worried him was that the rest of the world didn't feel it. And he gave this in his elegant and punchy style, and provoked a walkout from the Russian delegation, who had turned up from the city of St. Petersburg. And the head of the delegation who led the walkout was none other than Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, of whom we were to hear more later. And it was an amusing footnote to this that Meri's speech was given before the dinner, and the Russian delegation were deeply displeased with Putin for leading the walkout, because they'd been looking forward to a rather nice meal, and they missed it. But these warnings just came again and again and again in the 1990s and the noughties, at a time when the Western world, simply didn't want to listen. And I was sometimes even in the room where people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, indeed also Ukrainians and Russians would warn their Western interlocutors about the way in which things were developing in Russia. And this was both pre-Putin and during the era of supposed friendliness. And these warnings were dismissed, and the people who tried to deliver the warnings were patronized and belittled and told that they didn't understand Russia properly, and that we in Berlin or Brussels or Washington, or I'm afraid even in London, had a much better grasp of the big picture. And that if there was a problem with Russian imperialism, it was very minor, it was on the fringes of Russian politics, it was easily controlled, and there was no reason to get these things out of proportion. I remember one particular event in the German energy ministry in 2005, where the Germans were literally laughing when they were warned that their gas dependency and their intensifying gas dependency on Russia was going to be had political costs. And we've seen how that ended. And I also remember a meeting in the Kanzleramt in Berlin, where, again, we were literally laughed at when we warned that the Russian Federation might be using information operations against Germany. That was regarded as utterly absurd, and you cannot be serious, Herr Lucas, to be suggesting that. So I feel that this creates the basis for a certain amount of moral responsibility and even contrition, because the direct result of this complacency, arrogance, based, I think, on a big dose of a kind of Orientalism, where we can see Russia very clearly and all the countries in between are perhaps not seen very clearly, is that tens of thousands of people are dead, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives have been blighted with physical and mental trauma, and there's a bill for damage which is in excess of $1 trillion, and we face the risk of a lot more misery to come. And I'm delighted that some Western politicians, notably the Finnish Prime Minister, Hanna Saari, has expressed a degree of apology for this, but I'm still missing this from people like Steinmeier, who was the great architect of the German policy of Wandel durch Handel, or Wandel durch Ernährung, getting closer and trading more and therefore being friendly, and from Chancellor Scholz, and indeed from the rapidly rotating cast of British political leaders. There doesn't seem to be any realization that we have missed many opportunities to constrain Russian imperialist bullying. One might mention the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, the war in Georgia in 2008, many assassinations and attempted and successful ones, sabotage, other things going on in inside Europe, the kidnapping of Eston Korva across the Estonian border a few years back, and of course the attack on Ukraine in 2014. And at every stage, we've decided to play it cool, softly, don't get things out of proportion. And the result has been to signal to Putin that you can get away with this stuff, and to get away with it, he does. So that's my first point. The second thing I want to look at is, where is this conflict being fought? And it seems to me there are three fronts. There is what one might call the Western front, the fight for Western public opinion and for decision makers' attention and for our willingness to make sacrifice. There's the Moscow front, which is what's going on inside Russia with all the strains and stresses caused by the war. And then there's the Ukrainian military front, the attack, which almost all happening inside Ukrainian territories. That's where I located. Of course, there are some extraordinarily surprising and careless acts of sabotage or possibly discarding of cigarettes happening inside Russian territory as well. And they all intersect, and they lead towards the endgame, which is what I'm going to try and end up by outlining. It seems to me, and I'm aware that there are people on this in this call who are deeply expert in this, that the Russian political system is under its greatest strain now since Putin took power. The things that were the fundamental girders of the foundations of his legitimacy are all under extreme stress, and we're seeing people saying and doing things that we haven't seen before. So clearly the whole idea of stability, which was his greatest achievement, the idea that tomorrow was going to be like today and today was like yesterday, something which he's delivered for a unique 22-year period. There's been no period in Russian history, either in the Soviet period or before, when more people had more basic personal freedoms to travel, get the kind of job they want, live where they want, marry who they want, go abroad if they want, save in hard currency if they want. There's been no period where more people have enjoyed these basic freedoms in a predictable environment than under Putin. That's his great achievement. But I think that's come under threat, not just from the economic upheaval that's followed the outbreak of the war, but also because of the psychological strain of mobilization. You don't know if you yourself or your husband, brother, son, even father, whatever, will be shipped off to go and freeze in the mud somewhere in Ukraine with no notice, no equipment. And the result of this has been to widen what Vladimir Pozner called the corridor for discussion. There's always a corridor for discussion. It can be extremely narrow, as it was in the Soviet period. It can get very wide, as it was in the Yeltsin and early Putin period. And it's narrowed a lot now. But people are saying things on television that would have been unheard of only a few months ago, criticizing corruption, incompetence, delusion, false assumptions. There's a huge lump of blame. I see it a bit like ball lightning flying around the Russian political stage at the moment, and it's not quite clear where it's going to land, but when it does land, it will zap quite badly whoever it lands. And I think that's bad for Putin. It may even land on him, of which more later. We see also people like Kadyrov and Prigozhin and others conducting what are sort of political maneuvers in quite a striking way. Regional leaders, particularly the mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin, coming out pretty firmly that they don't like this conscription. There's not going to be any more of it. And this all undermines the sort of basic premise of the Putin regime, which is the guy at the top keeps everything under control. You may have, there may be arguments, but they never threaten the authority of the center. And this seems to me no longer to be the case. That Putin's popularity, which is the fundamental basis for his power, is, has not actually eroded yet, but is under threat. And people are already beginning to think the boss is not going to be around forever. How do I make my disposition so that if he goes down, I don't go down with him? And so there's an element of instability, which I think is quite new in Moscow politics. And that intersects and feeds on the military chaos in Ukraine. My friend and former think tank colleague, General Ben Hodges, knows a great deal more about military things than I do. And he's remarkably optimistic about the, or pessimistic from a Russian point of view, about how things are going. He highlights the way in which the Ukrainian long-range precision strikes have degraded, excuse me, the already pretty fragile Russian logistics chain. Modern military machines require large numbers of seals, filters, large quantities of lubricants, as well as all the ammunition and food and other spare parts you need. And these seem to be coming under increasing stress. So it looks as though there's a substantial military defeat looming in Kherson for the Russians, and that there's not much that they can do about it apart from this scorched, or perhaps in this case frozen earth tactic that they're adopting. And so the worse things go on the military side, the more that feeds back into the already highly stressed political environment in Moscow. And I suspect that the more the environment in Moscow is stressed, the worse the military decisions become. And then there's the third front, which in a way may be the decisive one, which is the Western front, what's happening in the West. The Ukrainian resistance is enormously dependent on the supply of particularly American weapons, funneled chiefly through Poland. Other countries have done a lot more in proportional terms. It's worth noting that Estonia has donated 1% of its GDP to Ukraine in military and humanitarian aid, and very substantial, similar, proportionate contributions made from Latvia and from Lithuania. And Britain's done quite a lot relative to our rather skimpy stockpiles, but in the end, the country that really matters is the United States, and the place that really matters is Poland. And the sanctions on Russia from the European Union also have an important constraining effect, although much, I think, less important than we hoped at the beginning. So it's therefore really vital that that keeps going. We need financial support to keep the Ukrainian state from from collapsing, and the military equipment is still not nearly enough. It's really worth thinking, if we delivered 1/4, 1/10 of what we are delivering now to Ukraine at the beginning of the war, there wouldn't be a war. If we'd had that sort of military aid, or indeed a very modest military presence in Ukraine before February the 24th, Putin, I think, would have regarded the wars as impossible. And at every stage, we are waiting until more Ukrainians die, freeze, and suffer before we then do something that we thought was previously impossible. So we're now moving towards possibly providing fighter jets, providing more man-pads for shooting down drones, produce better air defenses. There's more HIMARS coming, more training happening, but it's always behind the curve. And I think this underlines the point I made at the beginning about Western culpability, that we're always rather little and rather late. And then we expect the Ukrainians to be extremely grateful for what we're doing, whereas in fact we should be grateful to them because they're fighting not just for their own freedom and security, but also ours. And I don't know which way it's going to go in terms of this Western front. I've just got off the phone from a long call with my friends in Washington, and it seems to me, as far as we know, that although the Republicans may put, and assuming the Republicans do make gains in the midterms, although they will put the aid to Ukraine under greater scrutiny, and they may try and extract some concessions from the White House on some other peripheral issues, the Republicans in Congress are still going to be broadly supportive of this of this military aid program. They may want the Europeans to do more, but I would agree with that. I think Europeans should do more. So I think we are not at the moment facing a sort of dramatic flip-flop in American policy, much though Putin may hope for it. I'm also reasonably, I'm fairly confident that we won't see a big flip in European public opinion based on the levels of hardship we have at the moment. But I think that could change, and I think it's well worth thinking about what happens if Putin declares an oil embargo for a couple of months and says, I'm not going to export any oil, any crude or refined products to any unfriendly countries. And that sends oil up to $150 a barrel for the countries of the EU and NATO, and that will have quite an effect. He could also cut off the remaining natural gas, which is still rather remarkably flowing to the EU through Ukraine, despite the war and the small amount that flows through Belarus. So he could try and use the energy weapon a bit more dramatically at the depths of the winter. And it's possible this will lead to some arm twisting. And that's really getting onto the end game. That's really his only way out. He has to hope that he can give the West enough of a headache that we try and arm twist the Ukrainians into accepting some sort of ceasefire. Now, I suspect most people on the call will share my view that an arm twisted ceasefire delivered from instigated by the West could be absolutely disastrous. It would give Putin the victory, or at least the claim of victory that he seeks. It would show that the West is fundamentally weak, buckles under economic pressure, would be very bad for our credibility in the rest of the world, and would feed, I think, exactly the tendencies we don't want within the Russian Federation. It would show that the combination of military and economic pressure does bring territorial gains, and that in the end the West is, to use the Chinese phrase, a paper tiger. I don't think that's at all the most likely outcome, but it is there, and we need to keep a very cold and bleak eye on that possibility insofar as we're in decision making or positions or have any influence. We need to keep guarding against that. There are also 4 myths that worry me, which I think it's worth highlighting, all of which will have a bearing on the West's willingness to back Ukraine and to resist. The first is the kind of lazy realpolitik. All wars end in negotiations. Even a bad peace is better than a good war. Both sides are at fault in this conflict. We might as well recognize it. Let's close this down now that everybody's made their point. And there's a kind of knowing, world-weary approach which one gets from some professional IR practitioners. Perhaps Mearsheimer is the leading protagonist here, from journalists such as Peter Hitchens, who I debated a couple of days ago in central London, and other people from that ilk. And they say in the end, we don't really have a dog in this fight, and we should just try and settle it as clearly as speedily as we can. There's a related myth which bothers me a lot, which is that the war has shown that there's no real military threat from Russia. In the end, this was an enormous failure. 15 years of military modernization, and they can't even deal with the very lightly armed and disorganized Ukrainian resistance that we saw at the beginning of the war. And they've certainly got no answer to the Ukrainians. Now the Ukrainians have at least some modern weapons. And I think that's also deeply mistaken. A threat is a mixture of capability and intent, and what this war has clearly shown is that there's extremely malevolent intent towards neighbours. And it's worth remembering, as the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians would point out, that the amount of territory that Russia was able to occupy and then despoil and create atrocities on is considerably larger than the entire land area of the Baltic states. It's possible that we might get a ceasefire, and Russia would take some years to rebuild its military capability after the damage that it's sustained. But I think that if we don't deliver a stinging, decisive defeat to the kind of imperialist mindset which is driving this war, it will come back to haunt us, either again in Ukraine or in other parts of the world. And a sort of related third myth in this is that the threat from Russia is only military. What we've seen in terms of the North Sea, Nord Stream pipeline blown up, and the not yet attributed, but troubling damage to undersea cables, as well as the efforts Russia's making to exert influence in some of the countries where it's been building up its influence over the past years, shows that the threat from Russia is not just military. It's sabotage and cyber attacks, which are extensive and have been rather underreported in my view, and also all the other sort of hybrid warfare toolkit which Russia has deployed in so many ingenious and unpleasant ways over so many years. And there's a fourth myth, which I just want to touch on, which is that in the end, China just matters more, and that this is all a terrible distraction from what we should be concentrating on, which is the really existential conflict with the people, with the Chinese Communist Party, and we should be focusing on that rather than what's essentially a kind of European family squabble with Putin. So I think all these are wrong. It is actually a war about values in the end. It's about whether we think a country like Ukraine has the right to choose its own geopolitical orientations. Does it have the right to choose West if it wants to? Does it have the right to elect its leaders freely? Does it have the right to develop its national identity the way that it wants? And do its people have the right to have the liberty, security, dignity, and other features of modern life that we enjoy so unthinkingly in the West? and that is a long way from this sort of clever clogs realpolitik that we hear from the from some academics. Ukrainians want what we've got, and why shouldn't they have it? It's actually pretty simple. And if they lose, we're much worse off, and if they win, we're much better off. I've already touched on Russia's capabilities. They remain substantial, and I think that a wounded but not fully defeated Russia will find plenty other ways to make life more unpleasant for us and other countries in future. And on the China front, I think that this is actually a kind of dress rehearsal in a way for the Chinese, the difficulties we face with China. If we get this right, and the West emerges from this as a united and effective force in world politics, that's really important. That gives heart to countries all over the Western Pacific who are wondering, is the West really credible? And it will signal to Xi Jinping that his idea of an imperialist adventure in Taiwan is likely to have much higher costs than he might have otherwise thought. It'll also underline to the United States that Europeans can be useful allies if we prove ourselves to be useful allies. It also underlines to the Europeans that we're strategically naked without the United States. Just imagine how badly we would be faring if we had not got the United States helping us on Ukraine. So I think all those four myths basically fall apart under examination, but it's worth just bearing them in mind because so many people believe them either implicitly or explicitly. I want to finish off with what is our post-Putin strategy, because I think that, and people may disagree with me on this, and I'll be happy to discuss it in the question, but I think we're moving towards the end of the Putin regime, and I've said it's a bit of a gamble, but I think I'm right that this is his last winter. That maybe that his regime ends with a tap on the shoulder and a sort of Khrushchevian or Gorbachevian retirement. It may be that it's rather more the sort of Romanov style, and either shots are heard in the courtyard and he's made to go, he is actually shot in the courtyard. But one way or another, I think that this is he's moving towards the end. But I don't think that necessarily makes it any better for us. I've always, as I argued at the beginning of this talk, our problems with Russia predate Putin, and I think they will outlast him until we get a sort of fundamental change in the regime. I think the main feature of Putin's departure is that he will be a very convenient scapegoat, and whoever comes in to power after him will be able to blame the war on him. They will obviously praise him for all the other things he's done, but they will say that this was a terrible mistake, this war, very incompetently conducted. And that will allow them to accept whatever ceasefire needs to be accepted to avoid an absolutely thoroughgoing military collapse, which is the way that they are headed if things continue on their current trajectories. They blame that on Putin. And then the question is, what happens next? And you have some kind of junta or some other sort of unpleasant semi-militarized regime, very angry with the West, very keen to get its own back, licking its wounds after defeat in Ukraine. And I don't know who in the West is really thinking about how to deal with that. It seems to be we don't have sort of strategy for containing that kind of Russian regime over 5, 10 years, even longer. And I wish we did. I think we need to think about rebuilding our resilience and our deterrence to deal with a post-Putin Russia, shoring up post-war Ukraine, which is going to need the most enormous amount of economic and social reconstruction after the damage, and also providing security guarantees, which, if not actual NATO membership, are at least enough to make sure that Russia doesn't try coming back for a rematch or a second helping. So I would be thrilled if I thought people in London or Brussels or Berlin or Washington were really thinking hard about a post-Putin strategy. And as far as I can see, the only people who are really working on it are the Lithuanians, but that's lucky because they're often right about things. So I will stop there and look forward very much to your questions. And can I say that hostile questions are a great deal more interesting than friendly ones. So if you think I've made a crashing mistake, or indeed everything I've said is total rubbish, that will be most welcome.
Edward, thank you very much. I don't see any hostile questions at the moment, but some extremely interesting ones. And I think I'd like to start with a question that I think relates to the point you were making about the West doing too little and too late and always playing catch up. And this is Helen Goodman's question, which was whether the great mistake that Europe and NATO made was to give Ukraine more encouragement to look west over the past decade and not to really back it up, not to be prepared to back it up. What's your view on that?
I think that the Bucharest summit was a terrible mistake because the United States decided very late in the day that it did want a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia, but didn't do the spade work of convincing the allies that this was going to happen. And so we got this kind of undated check issued to Ukraine and Georgia, which both signaled to Russia that something might happen they didn't like, but also that we weren't really serious about doing it. And I think that gave a sort of greenish light to, if we'd wanted to signal to Russia, get going now on Ukraine before we start focusing on it. We could have hardly had a better way of doing it. And I remember writing this up for the Economist in fairly stark terms at the time. I think that the most important thing really for Ukraine was to create breathing space for civil society to develop, and for people like Zelensky and others to start getting into positions of power, because in the days when Ukraine was run by people like Kuchma and let alone Kravchuk, but even Yushchenko, actually, it was really hard to see them as imminent NATO or Ukraine members, because the country was just so badly run. It was not just corrupt, but also shambolic in so many ways. And that was, of course, the result of the trauma of Sovietization, and it was probably unavoidable. So the best thing we could have done, I think, was to buy Ukraine breathing space to develop, rather than being treating it as a square on a geopolitical chessboard. I think that EU membership was much more important than NATO membership in terms of making that happen. And I would have put most of my chips on, if I'd been in charge of trying to get that going. And of course, it was in the end that which provoked when Yushchenko Yanukovych was sort of caught on the horns of the dilemma at which you go. That was what really got the Ukrainians furious, was the thought that he was sacrificing their EU orientation in exchange for a large lump of money from Moscow. So I think we played it quite badly. But I also think that post 2014, thank goodness we did what we did. There was just enough training and help to the post 2014 government that they were able to put up a decent resistance and buy time for us to deliver more support. But in the end, the fact is these great many people are dead, and no one can look on that with anything other than horror.
Thank you. There are some questions which I think are in some ways touch on different aspects of the same question. James Nixie has asked about whether the corollary of Russian defeat is humiliation. And Jeffrey Hosking has asked what would constitute total Ukrainian victory. And Michael Holman has asked, how will we know that Ukraine has won, and for how long? And perhaps related to that, Stephen Hall's question about, is there a point, possibly coming soon, where negotiations could begin, whether, as you mentioned before, Putin is probably hoping for Western Europe to arm twist Ukraine, into negotiations. But Stephen makes the point that there may be pressure from the US too, and that there is a suggestion that if Ukraine does take Kherson, that might be the point to persuade them to open negotiations. So these are also slightly intertwined, but
yes. Well, I think the first thing is I feel that it's very important the Ukrainians are making these decisions as far as possible, because any deal that they make is more likely to stick. And one of the lessons from 2014, 2015 is that the Minsk agreements didn't stick, because actually neither side was serious about implementing them. Both sides signed up because that was what was on the table, and there were reasons to be seen to be agreeing. But there was, and I think that for a peace deal to stick, both sides have to be you have to have a mutually hurting stalemate, where neither side thinks they're going to get what they want on the battlefield. If you don't have that, it may just be a truce where both sides are trying to regroup in order that they can go back and try and win militarily. So it's easy to see where Russia might be wanting to negotiate if they find that Crimea is under regular attack from precision strikes, and they're losing ships in Sevastopol from Ukrainian drones. The Crimean population is fleeing. The bridge is under attack. The financial cost of keeping these occupied territories going is mounting. There's absolutely no chance of victory. The energy weapon hasn't worked. The Ukraine's getting stronger by the day. You can see how Russia gets on the back foot. The question is, what would make the Ukrainians feel they don't want to keep on fighting? And I think one important issue here is the cost of reconstructing and restoring the liberated territories. Ukraine is under great stress at the moment. And what I'm hearing, and if there are Ukrainians on the call who want to contradict me, I'm happy to be contradicted, is it's really quite difficult when you arrive in one of these places and the inhabitants have largely fled, the infrastructure is devastated, there are no public services. If there are people living there, some of them may be not terribly pleased to see Ukrainians, because they were there because they supported the Russians. The expectations among the ones who are pro-Ukrainian could be huge, and then disappointment is intense. They say, why is the power not back on? Where's the water? Where's the sewerage? Where's the we want schools and hospitals and windows and all this stuff. We want it yesterday because we've suffered so much under occupation, and the Ukrainian state finds that difficult. So I can imagine a point at which the Ukrainians feel they've recovered as much as that they can restore, and that they actually might not want to take every square foot of Donetsk and of the Luhansk and LPR and LNR and DNR. So that would be one thing. And of course, another is if they feel the West is losing its enthusiasm for supplying, or indeed that the West has lost its capability, because there are physical limits to our stockpiles for some of these things, and we are unable to manufacture them in the sort of time frame that is needed. So there may be some sort of really hard constraints coming up in terms of what we can do within the sort of existing parameters. So those are, I think, the sort of the two sides of the equation. When Ukrainians feel they don't they want to stop fighting for whatever reason, and the Russians want to stop fighting, and then you get into a negotiation. I think it's going to be difficult for Putin to be on one side of that table. I think that the humiliation of having gone so badly wrong is going to accelerate the changes in Moscow. And if I had to bet, I'd say that there'll be some other person representing Russia. But when the talks are signed, it'll be Zelensky and someone else signing. But I may well be wrong on that. But I don't think we're going to kind of de-imperialize Russia in one go. And that I used to think that a really stinging defeat would actually lead to a sort of in a kind of 1945 moment in Russia, and that would be the end. And Russians say this whole imperialism thing has gone terribly wrong. We need try and be a normal country now. I hope Russia gets there eventually, but I think it's going to be more than one hop. So I think that, and this is why I think that our next thing will be to deal with the unpleasant post-Putin regime, which will blame this war on Putin, but won't resile from the whole sort of imperialist concept.
Very interesting. Thank you, Edward. I'll give you a chance to grab a drink.
Sorry, I apologize. I'm sipping my tea.
Yeah, you said in your talk that we should be grateful to Ukraine because they're fighting a war on our behalf, or for us. There's an interesting question here that puts it a slightly different way from Chris Hayden. How would you answer the idea that Ukraine is having to fight a proxy war with Russia on behalf of the USA?
Well, I think that having is implies that Ukraine was quite happy the way things were, and then the Americans came along and said, "We want you to take on Russia for us." Sort of a sort of dog being put in the ring and told, "Right, there's a dog fight now, and you're our dog, so get fighting." And I don't really recognise that. I think that the attitudes towards the United States in Ukraine were quite lukewarm for quite a long time. There was an even quite an ambivalent attitude towards Europe, and that was exemplified in the sort of orange-blue split in the election that Yanukovych won. And I think it was the kind of the blue camp, which you could sort of very loosely call the sort of pro-Russian camp, well, I think that's not quite accurate, burnt up its credibility through corruption and incompetence. At a time when generational change and integration of Ukraine into the world economy was gradually making Europe seem a much less distant prospect, a much more realistic one. And so I think that the pro-Western orientation in Ukraine was largely, not exclusively, but largely a pro-European one. And it's only since the war started that the United States and Britain have become so important from a military point of view. So I don't think, and I think that the United States was not, under the Biden administration, it was very clear, and actually Trump as well, that Europe is a bit of a distraction from the main thing, which is China. They would very much like not to have to put more troops in Europe. They would very much like to have European help on China, and there's a bit of a quid pro quo. But I don't think anyone in the Biden or before that Trump administration thought, here's a good idea. Why don't we have a big war? Let's have a big tussle with Russia, spend lots of money on Ukrainian weapons and see how sending weapons to Ukraine and see how it goes. I think they've been and you only have to look at the beginning of the war when they the instant reaction of the Jake Sullivan, the National Security Council, was to offer Zelensky a lift out of Ukraine and say whatever happens, this isn't going to escalate. And they've been, I think, have marched backwards into supporting Ukraine rather than forwards.
Now, our audience is having a go at some more critical questions now.
Good.
So Helen Goodman thinks that you have not taken account of the difficulty of making this a priority for Western voters. And in connection with that, Louise Third has asked what more the press could do, public opinion here. And Matthew Hume has also made a point, which I think you made in your talk, that Putin will be hoping that more privation for Western European countries will play into his hands. But so what more can be done to persuade Western voters that this is a priority?
Well, I think first of all, one has to be realistic that for many voters, it's always the sort of bread and butter issues that matter. And apparently for American voters, it's the price of gasoline is the sort of number one issue on how they vote. I'm slightly sceptical about this. Actually, I think it's I'm actually a parliamentary candidate, and I go out almost every day door knocking in the cities of London and Westminster, trying to get people interested in what's going on. And I find there's actually quite a lot of interest in Ukraine. And I mean, there's a bit of fear. There's a kind of, are we going to have a nuclear war, which people worry about. But there's also a lot of sympathy. And I think that whereas in 1991, Ukraine was utterly was otherland. It was a place that people just hadn't really heard of at all. The result of the last 30 years is that our map of Eastern Europe has gone from black and white to colour, and we are much more aware of, we know people who may have work colleagues, may have people who, the stereotypical builder or plumber or whatever, but it's now, I think it's become a sort of real place with real people, and the idea that that real place with real people has real hopes and real fears and really wants to live the kind of life that we do, echoes with us. So it's very different. I remember trying to get people interested in the fighting in Moldova in sort of 1990 to 91 era, and you could not get, and no one knew where it was on the map or could see why it should care, why they should care. So I think that's changed a lot, and fundamentally we want to be safe. And there is a sort of Peter Hitchens view, which is no continental entanglements, leave NATO, just have a navy, and don't the whole idea of alliances is futile, and in that isolationist strand is there, and it's also there in the United States. But I think most people reckon that we need alliances, and that the values are worth defending and we're safer in some sort of rule-based order than in a might is right, dog eat dog sort of world. And that's what this war's about. Do you want big countries to do the deals that they can and the small countries to suck up the fates that they must, to paraphrase Thucydides? What should the press do? Well, I just think I don't think that I don't believe in sort of agenda-driven coverage. I think report what's happening, and I think that it's actually been the coverage of Ukraine, the Ukraine war's been spectacularly good on the whole. There's some terrific freelancers there. There's been a huge effort by the big broadcasters, particularly the BBC coverage has been stellar, I think. And my former paper, The Economist, has I think done some fantastic work. And I also would commend not a phrase I say very often, I commend the Daily Mail. I think Ian Burrell's coverage for the Mail has really brought it home to Middle England in a most compelling way. And I think and although there's a bit of Ukraine fatigue, I mean, sort of the massacres and war crimes and so on drops from being front page to page 6, people are still interested. And if you ask, is there any politician outside Britain who would draw a bigger crowd than Zelensky if he came to London? I can't think of him.
Yeah, thank you. Edward, there's an interesting point here from Michael Holman, just sort of a slightly different geopolitical angle, that you haven't yet said anything about the latent danger of the increasing support for Russia in countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, and especially Serbia, where right-wing ultranationalist groups are gaining in popularity. Michael's question is, how does one counter this development?
I think that this has proved quite a bad investment from the Kremlin's point of view. And they put we saw in Ukraine, they put billions into cultivating Ukrainian officials and politicians who turned out to be largely useless when the war started. And I think that they've probably seen, I'm making this up because I don't want to be sued for libel, it probably seemed very impressive from a Moscow point of view to have the sort of deputy state secretary for infrastructure in Berlin, Brandenburg, or wherever on the take, and okaying various things to do with the gas distribution network and having politicians from Die Linke and the AfD coming to Moscow and perhaps getting brown envelopes along the way, and putting lots of money into boosting the RT and all these sort of stations. And you can see the way where they are putting their money for these influence operations. And it hasn't really made much difference in the end, for all their efforts to cultivate the SPD. Scholz says, right, we're putting defense spending up. Russia's a serious threat. Let's get on with it. The sort of supposed bastions of Russian influence, like Hungary, didn't veto EU. Hungary and Cyprus, supposedly, the key players for Russia in the EU, neither of them vetoed the EU sanctions, or even came close to doing so, as far as I remember. The right-wing nationalist groups in the Western Balkans love talking about Russia, but when you drill down a bit, they don't speak Russian. They've never been to Russia. They don't actually know anything about Russia. It's sort of performative, pro-Russian behavior. It doesn't seem to lead. It's a bit like the sort of pro-Chinese lobby, which tends to be it's kind of skin deep. And I see, in the end, Serbia, which is perhaps the single most quote pro-Russian unquote country outside the EU in Europe, desperately trying to find alternatives to Russian energy because they've realized how dependent they are. So I still worry about Russia's capability to do subversion, and maybe with more economic stress, more will happen. There was a large pro-Kremlin demonstration in Italy the other day. There was one in Prague, but it doesn't seem to me to be filtering through into decision making. And on the whole, the pleasant surprises far outnumber the unpleasant ones. Giorgia Meloni, for example, the first far-right leader of Italy, seems to be absolutely forthright in her condemnation of Putin, shows no sign of wanting to follow the Berlusconi line. He's history, and she, to use fascist rhetoric, she would say, he's the past and I'm the future.
Yeah. Ed, we have a little bit more time. I'd just like to pick up on Anthony Wolstenholme's question about EU sanctions. Now, I know you have done a huge amount of work on kleptocracy and trying to prevent sort of kleptocratic abuse of British institutions. But Anthony makes the point here that you've described the EU sanctions as ineffectual and wants to know how you would strengthen them. And I wonder if I could perhaps juxtapose that question with a couple of others, which, coming from a slightly different point of view, suggesting that perhaps we humiliated Russia or didn't fully take account of the humiliating effect of some of the things we've done in the past, and perhaps that we've been insufficiently sensitive to the desires of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. I don't throw all that into one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure. I'm always a bit hesitant about this idea that it's we. In the end, it's for Ukraine to sort out its own policies on language, school curriculum, decentralization, and so on. We can give advice, and they may take it, but it's. I wouldn't make that the sort of centerpiece of the argument. We have the OSCE, which is quite good at looking at, and they have a Commission for National Minorities, which does lots of good work in making these issues as boring as possible in order to defuse them. I think the humiliation of Russia largely takes place in the minds of Russians because they've never accepted, and I'm talking about sort of the broadly Russian decision makers, that Russia should be treated as just another country. Yeah, there has to be some special relationship because they're so big. Yeah, we've got nuclear weapons, we're a P5 member, largest landmass. And in a sense, that's absolutely right, and we do treat them. We made them members of the G8, for example, which was important and probably not justified in terms of their economic strength. But where the clash happens is about neighbours, and I think that, and I remember having this argument when I was working for Zan Smiley in Moscow in about 1998, talking to a Yeltsin, a Russian, who was saying, why can't we get on with the West? And I said, fundamentally, unless you can treat Estonia seriously as another country, you're always going to have problems with the West. And he said, but Estonia is 1 million people. And I said, and that's exactly the point, that from a Western point of view, the fact that Estonia has 1 million people, smallest of the then prospective EU candidates, that doesn't matter. It's still a country. It's still a subject of international law. We will treat them as seriously and respectfully as we treat other countries. And unless you can do that, you're always going to have a problem with us. And he said, well, in that case, we're always going to have a problem. We are never going to treat a country like Estonia as a serious country, or indeed we have difficulty in remembering it's a country at all. For us, it's a sort of speck of land. And I think that sort of sums it up, really. And post-1945 Germany doesn't have a problem treating its smaller neighbours as countries. It's learned you have to do that, even though they are, most of Germany's neighbours, small neighbours, are the size of a German federal state. But that doesn't make any difference. They still treat them seriously. In terms of the sanctions, I think that we wildly overestimated the effect of sanctions, as we almost always do. I'm 60, so we've had sanctions on Cuba for my entire life, and the Communist Party is still running Cuba. We've had sanctions on Iran, we've had sanctions on North Korea, we've had sanctions on lots of other countries, at Zimbabwe, and they almost never produce the result we want. They may sometimes weaken the target of the sanctions. they almost always enrich the sanction busters. And we had this idea that by chucking Russia off SWIFT, this would lead a sort of single devastating karate chop to the neck for the Russian economy, and they just wouldn't be able to withstand that. In fact, it turned out they could withstand it pretty well. So is there more we could do? Yes. We are still sending €1 billion a day, I think, to Russia for Russian oil, and we could have a whole session on how we could have a much more muscular policy. We could have a sort of buyer's cartel, and we could use secondary sanctions on anyone else who buys Russian oil. So we could give them more of the sort of Iranian treatment, and that might work. But in the end, I think they have a buffer, which is China, and China is willing to backstop them a fair bit. And perhaps we should talk about China a bit more, because we haven't. But I think that we've on a scale of 0 to 10, we're about 8 in terms of what we can do on sanctions, and I'm not sure even getting it up to 10 would make a difference. What will really make a difference is the political stress inside the Kremlin and the military defeat on the battlefield.
Thank you. I hope that might also answer Craig Oliphant's question on sanctions as well. I think, Edward, would you be happy to take one last question?
Of course, yeah, this is fascinating. I love this.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Well, look, this is a question from Ian Bond, which is actually looking to the future now. Ian's making the point that how concerned should we be about Ukrainian internal politics reasserting itself at some point? The question is there more the West can do to promote good governance and ensure that post-war Ukraine is a less corrupt and dysfunctional place than it was pre-February?
Well, this is enormously important, and I think that we've seen the triumph of Ukrainian self-organization in the initial response to the war. What was so remarkable was the way in which Ukrainians just got together to provide equipment for the military units, whether making Molotov cocktails, but this sort of decentralized, spontaneous side was almost sort of anarcho-syndicalism in Ukraine, which was such a contrast to the sort of centralized, incompetent, top-down approach of the Russian invaders. and there's tremendous momentum behind that still. It would be nice to think that the spillover from this into more formal political institutional structures will have a beneficial effect post-war in Ukraine. But I don't know. I mean, I worry that post-war Ukraine will be a bit like post-war France, sort of, victorious, sure, plenty of glory, but boy, was it! I mean, if you read the books about post-war France, what a mess. I mean, economically ruined by the occupation, such divisions between the people who'd in occupied France, unoccupied France, people who collaborating, people who hadn't, people who'd been abroad with the goal, people who'd stayed at home, people who got recompense and recognition for what they'd suffered, and people who didn't. And it's taken France a long time to work through that. And I fear that there will be quite a lot of that in Ukraine, and it's going to be a very difficult. It's going to be a very difficult business. Obviously, we can do what we can to cushion it through the reconstruction, making sure the reconstruction money doesn't get stolen. But Ukraine, before the war, Ukraine was in quite a mess. The gloss had rubbed off Zelensky, and but I've also heard people say that Ukraine's going to be much more like Israel was after its the sort of the cathartic effect of a founding war, the military as being absolutely central to the state and with deep roots in society, and that we should. But I don't know so much about Israel, so I don't know. I think there's also going to be. I think one thing that has happened, which is really important, is that this idea of Ukraine being divided between quote Russian speakers and quote Ukrainian speakers has been fundamentally bust. This has been the most tremendously. It's been the crucible of a Ukrainian civic identity that's not based on ethnicity or language. It's based on an idea, and that's enormously welcome. And so that's the huge positive to take away. Can I say it's been absolutely delightful that no one has asked me about nuclear weapons, which is normally the first question I get. I don't know if anyone wants to do that now, and I do think possibly we should just spend a minute or two on China, which hasn't really come up. But I don't know if anyone's got a question on either of those.
Well, in fact, somebody did ask, was it all a bluff? Nuclear weapons.
Well, yes. I mean, I think this is a war of nerves rather than a war of nukes. And it's one of Putin's, as I said earlier, it's one of Russia's real claim to the top table. It's really hard to see what the military utility of any actual use of nuclear weapons would be. The threat is can dismay, deter. And if he was to say, don't supply Ukraine with fighter jets, otherwise I will nuke you, and then we didn't, that would be that would be an example of the threat working. But in terms of the effect on the battlefield, these small nuclear devices don't make a huge difference. I think an enormous psychological effect, but the actual military utility is quite limited. It's worth remembering why does Russia have these battlefield nuclear weapons? They date from the days of the Warsaw Pact, and the idea was to smash the West's defenses in West Germany, so that the second and third echelon of the Western group forces could then punch through and get to the Rhine or beyond before the Americans had decided what to do. And that's a completely different. You're not looking at the need to destroy large numbers of British, American, and West German and French tanks, which was the sort of fundamental. That was the utility of the particularly of the neutron bomb. So I'm not. It has a great psychological effect, particularly at the beginning. But even that, I think, is diminishing. It was the number one thing at the beginning of the war was, oh my goodness, Russia's got nuclear weapons. If we help Ukraine, they'll use them. And as time's gone on, we've done more and more. Nothing's actually happened. And so that sort of nuclear bogey has diminished a bit. And I find it quite interesting that Putin has to say rather plaintively, I'm not bluffing, which is usually a sign that people have tacitly accepted that there's a perception they're bluffing. And then there's China. And I think the Chinese, it's absolutely clear the Chinese do not want Russia using this nuclear. They have the very strict nuclear doctrine in China. The nuclear weapons are only there to prevent other countries attacking China with nuclear weapons. That's one thing they're for. And they don't like any blurring of this. And I suspect if Putin was seriously thinking of using nuclear weapons, among the many obstacles that were put in his way, might be a very firm phone call from Xi Jinping, among other things.
Mm. Thank you. I think we won't take any more questions, Edward. We're now 6:15. Thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. And I was very, very heartened to hear what you had to say about Ukrainian self-organization and the galvanizing effect of all this on Ukrainian civil society, because this is what we are seeing every day at the BEARR Trust through the Ukraine appeal. The response of civil society in getting emergency supplies out, which is what we're doing, it's been absolutely extraordinary and very heartening. And this is my shameless plug moment here. Well, apart from the shameless plug for the appeal itself, but we are actually holding a conference on the 18th of November. It's a hybrid conference, in person in London and on Zoom. And it's on the civil society response to the conflict. And some of the people we've been working with on the ground in Ukraine will be speaking there. We will have Ukrainian and Russian interpretation. I think it should be very interesting. You're very welcome to attend, anybody who is here tonight. And the information is all on the BEARR Trust website.
Well, can I just add my own support for please do donate as generously as you possibly can. There are 125 people on the call, I see, and if everybody gave £1,000, that'd be £125,000. If everybody gave 100, that would still be quite a lot. So there's I think I can't imagine a more important cause, and I wish you every success in future fundraising.
Thank you very much indeed, and spread the word. And thank you for these tremendous insights. I think that what you have given us tonight is a very clear roadmap of what the moves could be en route to the end game. It's made it a much more tractable subject to think about.
Thanks.
And to understand. It's a very rich explanation.
Well, I'm sorry for my appalling cough, which came out of nowhere. And if anyone wants to join me on the doorstep, they're very welcome to come and try and explain all this to the voters. It's not as hard as it sounds.
Thank you very much. You may well find a few people doing the stump with you.
Super. Well, thank you all very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. I wish you all a very good evening. Bye-bye.